April 18, 1944, 11:47 a.m. 30,000 feet above Munich, Lieutenant Robert Johnson pushed the throttle of his P-47 Thunderbolt forward and watched a shape appear beneath him that didn't belong in the sky. It moved like nothing he'd seen in 2 years of combat. No propeller, no visible means of thrust, just speed. Pure, impossible speed. The German jet fighter passed below him at 540 miles per hour, leaving his Thunderbolt standing still in the air. Johnson's P-47 could manage 430 miles per hour in level flight on a good day with favorable winds. This thing was 110 miles per hour faster. The gap wasn't closable. It wasn't even theoretical. Johnson pulled hard, banking left, trying to track the target. His engine screamed at maximum RPM. Oil temperature spiked into the red zone. The stick vibrated in his gloved hands with the strain of metal pushed beyond design limits. He couldn't catch it. Nobody could. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, tried anyway. Hayes dove, trading altitude for speed, pushing his Thunderbolt into a near-vertical descent. He gained 30 miles per hour, then 40. The jet pulled away anyway, climbing effortlessly while Hayes fought gravity and engine torque just to maintain sight. The Messerschmitt Me 262 disappeared into cloud cover 7 seconds after first visual contact. Johnson's gun cameras captured 4 frames, blurred images, gray metal against white sky, swept wings, twin engine nacelles. No visible exhaust trail because the jet burned fuel so cleanly there was nothing left to see. When intelligence officers reviewed the footage 3 days later, one analyst wrote a single line in the margin of his report. If they'd had this 2 years ago, we'd have lost the air war. By the spring of 1944, American bomber crews flying over Germany faced losses that command refused to publish. On some missions, 20% didn't return. Flak tore through aluminum fuselages at 12,000 feet. Focke-Wulf 190s attacked in formation, slashing through bomber groups with coordinated precision. B-17 crews called it the gauntlet. You flew in, dropped your payload, and prayed the formation held long enough to reach friendly airspace. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers over Berlin in a single day. 690 men. Some bailed out over enemy territory. Some died in burning aircraft that spiraled down, trailing smoke for 30,000 feet. Some made it back to England with hydraulic systems destroyed, landing gear jammed, and wounded crewmen bleeding out in shattered gun turrets. Every mission was mathematics. Probability versus altitude. Speed versus fuel. 10 men per aircraft, 40 aircraft per group. Do the numbers. Multiply the groups by the missions. Add the losses. Subtract the crews that never made it home. The numbers didn't favor survival. A bomber crew's odds of completing a 25-mission tour without casualties hovered around 30% by early 1944. That meant 7 out of 10 crews would lose at least 1 man, or the entire aircraft. But the jet changed the equation. A conventional fighter needed altitude and positioning. It climbed slowly, burned fuel fighting gravity, and gave gunners time to track movement. The Me 262 climbed at 4,000 feet per minute. It attacked from any angle, at any altitude, faster than human reflexes could compensate. American gunners couldn't lead the target. They couldn't calculate deflection angles when the enemy fighter closed at 150 meters per second. By the time they saw it, it was gone. By the time they fired, it was already behind them or 3,000 feet above, circling for another pass. The question intelligence analysts couldn't answer was this: why did Germany wait until 1944 to deploy a weapon they'd tested in 1942? Captured documents told a story stranger than battlefield failure. It was a story of arrogance, paranoia, and decisions made by men who believed speed was a liability. The Messerschmitt Design Bureau completed the first prototype jet engine tests on March 25, 1942. The aircraft flew. The engines worked. William Messerschmitt himself stood on the tarmac at Leipheim Airfield and watched his creation break every performance record the Luftwaffe had ever logged. He believed the war could be won in the air if production began immediately. He submitted a proposal to the Reich Air Ministry on April 2, 1942. Full operational deployment by January 1943. 600 aircraft, enough to shatter the Allied bombing campaign before it gained momentum. The proposal was denied, not because the jet didn't work, but because the men reviewing it didn't believe Germany needed it. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring told his staff the Me-262 was a solution to a problem that didn't exist. Germany controlled the skies over Europe in 1942. The Battle of Britain was over. The Eastern Front consumed resources, but the Luftwaffe still maintained superiority against Soviet aircraft. Göring's pilots had trained for years. They knew their aircraft. They trusted proven designs. The Bf109, the FW190, fighters tested in combat, built in factories already optimized for mass production. Retooling those factories for jet engines would take months. Resources would be diverted from proven platforms. And for what? A fighter that flew faster than a pilot could effectively aim? Göring's chief technical advisor, Ernst Udet, issued a memo on May 14, 1942. 3 sentences. The jet is too fast for visual combat. Pilots cannot track targets at 150 meter per second closure rates. Recommend conventional propeller development only. The memo killed 2 years of potential deployment. Messerschmitt appealed. He brought data, performance graphs, fuel efficiency calculations, wind tunnel results showing the swept-wing design reduced drag by 18% compared to conventional fighters. He argued that jet speed wasn't a flaw, it was an evolution of air combat doctrine. Bombers flew in formations, predictable trajectories. A jet didn't need to dogfight. It could dive, fire a concentrated burst from 4 30mm cannons, and climb away before enemy gunners registered the attack. The standard engagement time would drop from 40 seconds to less than 5. That wasn't a disadvantage. That was revolutionary. The Reich Air Ministry filed his appeal and moved on. By June 1942, the Me-262 program was classified as experimental research, low priority, limited funding, 4 test aircraft, no production line. Germany's most advanced fighter sat in a hangar while bureaucrats debated whether the future of air combat was worth the inconvenience of change. Then Hitler saw a prototype. November 2, 1943. Insterburg Airfield, East Prussia. Messerschmitt arranged a demonstration flight, hoping direct exposure to the Führer would override bureaucratic resistance. The jet performed flawlessly. Vertical climbs, high-speed passes, aerobatic maneuvers no propeller aircraft could replicate. The test pilot, Gerd Lindner, pushed the aircraft through a series of combat simulations, mock interceptions at 500 miles per hour, tight turns that would have ripped the wings off a conventional fighter. Hitler watched in silence from a wooden observation platform erected specifically for the demonstration. When the pilot landed, Hitler walked across the tarmac and asked a single question. "Can it carry bombs?" Messerschmitt hesitated. Technically, yes. The jet's airframe could support external ordnance, 2 500-kilogram bombs, 1 under each forward fuselage section. But adding bomb racks would increase weight by 1,100 kilograms. Drag would increase. Speed would decrease. The jet's primary advantage, its ability to strike and escape before enemy fighters could react, would be compromised. Fighter interception required altitude and speed. Bombing required stable flight paths, predictable trajectories, and prolonged exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Hitler didn't wait for clarification. He turned to his staff and issued an order. The Me-262 would be redesigned as a Schnellbomber, a fast bomber capable of striking Allied invasion forces before they established beachheads on the French coast. Production would not begin until the modification was complete. Messerschmitt tried to explain the tactical contradiction. Bombers require different flight profiles, different training, different operational doctrine. Bomb aiming systems needed to be installed. Pilots would need weeks of training to master dive bombing techniques at jet speeds.
A jet fighter converted into a bomber lost the precision that made it lethal against enemy aircraft. Hitler interrupted. "The jet will strike terror into the enemy before they reach our cities. It will carry vengeance, not dogfights." The order was final. No appeals, no debate. The redesign consumed 7 months. Engineers added bomb racks under the fuselage. They recalculated center of gravity tolerances. They modified cockpit instrumentation for dive bombing trajectories. Bomb release mechanisms required hydraulic systems that hadn't been part of the original design. Fuel capacity had to be reduced to compensate for the added weight. Range dropped from 650 miles to 490 miles. Dive angles were steeper than any pilot had trained for in jet aircraft. Recovery from attack runs burned excessive fuel because the engines needed full throttle to regain altitude while carrying ordnance. Every change slowed production. Every modification required new blueprints, new tooling, new training manuals. Every delay extended the window during which American and British bombers operated without effective opposition. By March 1944, Messerschmitt had produced 12 operational Me-262s configured as bombers. Pilots hated them. The added weight made the aircraft sluggish. Maximum speed dropped to 470 miles per hour when carrying bombs. Dive angles were too steep for accurate bomb release. Pilots had to maintain steady flight for 3 to 5 seconds during final approach to target, making them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Recovery from attack runs burned fuel at rates that left barely enough reserve to reach home airfields. One pilot, Oberleutnant Heinrich Baer, flew 3 sorties and refused to fly a 4th. His report, filed April 6, 1944, described the Schnellbomber as a fighter crippled by a dictator's fantasy. He wrote that carrying bombs negated every advantage the jet possessed. Speed was reduced. Maneuverability was compromised. Fuel consumption made long-range missions impossible. The Me-262, as a bomber, was worse than a conventional bomber and far less effective than the Me-262 as a fighter. Command suppressed the report. Baer was reassigned to a training squadron. His career ended not in combat, but in a bureaucratic office where dissent against Hitler's orders meant professional exile. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Robert Johnson's gun camera footage reached Washington, D.C. Intelligence analysts compared the jet's performance data against Allied fighter capabilities. The conclusion appeared in a classified briefing on May 1, 1944. Current Allied fighters cannot intercept the Me-262 in level flight. Bomber formations are defenseless against jet attacks. If mass deployment occurs, daylight bombing operations may become unsustainable. General Carl Spaatz, commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, read the briefing and made a decision. Bomb the jet factories. Target every airfield, production facility, and fuel depot associated with the Me-262 program. The 8th Air Force began Operation Chattanooga Choo-Choo on June 12, 1944. 1,600 bombers struck Messerschmitt facilities at Regensburg, Augsburg, and Leipzig over a 72-hour period. B-17s carried 500-pound general-purpose bombs designed to collapse factory roofs and destroy precision machinery. B-24s followed with incendiary clusters that ignited anything combustible inside damaged structures. The bombing runs weren't surgical. They were methodical. Wave after wave of bombers at staggered altitudes, each formation dropping payloads on coordinates marked by Pathfinder aircraft using radar guidance. Flak,
killed 63 aircraft. German fighters downed 41 more. Over 1,000 American airmen died or were captured during the three-day operation. But the factories burned, production lines stopped, cranes collapsed, assembly jigs melted. Machine tools used to fabricate turbine blades were buried under rubble. The Regensburg facility, which had been producing 4 Me-262 airframes per day, went offline for 11 weeks. By the time Germany reversed Hitler's bomber directive and returned the Me-262 to its fighter role, it was July 1944. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Soviet forces were pushing westward through Poland. Germany needed air superiority not over England, but over its own territory. The strategic situation had reversed completely. The jet that was supposed to prevent invasion now had to defend against occupying forces that had already breached Fortress Europe. The jets finally entered combat in August 1944.
Jagdverband 44, an elite unit commanded by Adolf Galland, flew the first operational missions from Brandenburg-Brest airfield. Galland was Germany's most experienced fighter ace. 204 confirmed kills. He'd requested the Me-262 for 2 years. Now, with fuel shortages, untrained pilots, and crumbling logistics, he had it. August 28, 1944. Galland intercepted a formation of B-17s over Merseburg. 40 bombers flying in tight formation at 22,000 feet. He approached from the rear at 520 miles per hour, closing the gap in seconds. The bombers hadn't seen him yet. Their tail gunners scanned the sky for conventional fighters, expecting threats from angles they'd trained to defend. Galland armed his 4 30mm Mk 108 cannons. Each cannon carried 60 rounds. He had 240 total shots. At his closing speed, he'd be in range for less than 3 seconds. He fired. A 2-second burst, 48 rounds. Tracer fire arced across the sky in lines so fast they looked solid. The explosive shells hit the trailing B-17 in the rear fuselage, wing root, and number 3 engine. The bomber exploded mid-air. No fire, no smoke trail, just an instant conversion from aircraft to debris. Galland climbed vertically, looped back, and destroyed a second bomber before American P-51 escorts could react. By the time the Mustang pilots registered movement, Galland was 3,000 feet above them, circling for another pass. He didn't make one. Fuel gauge showed reserves dropping below safety margins. He turned east and headed for Brandenburg-Brest. He landed 14 minutes after takeoff, with enough fuel for 3 more minutes of flight. 2 bombers destroyed, 20 men killed, 0 damage to his aircraft. The jet had worked exactly as Messerschmitt predicted 2 years earlier, but it was too late. Germany couldn't produce them fast enough. Fuel reserves were nearly depleted. Allied fighter sweeps destroyed jets on the ground faster than factories could replace them. By September 1944, fewer than 50 Me-262s were operational at any given time. Against a combined Allied air force of over 15,000 aircraft, 50 jets meant nothing strategically. They were a tactical nuisance, a psychological threat, but not a war-changing weapon. American bomber crews still feared them. The sight of a jet diving through formation triggered immediate defensive maneuvers. Gunners fired blindly, hoping to saturate airspace with enough lead to catch something moving too fast to track. Tracer fire lit the sky in arcs that never intersected with the jet's flight path. By the time gunners adjusted aim, the jet was already gone, climbing away or banking for another attack run. On September 18, 1944, a formation of B-24 Liberators over Osnabrück reported 3 jets attacking simultaneously from different angles. The bombers tightened formation, closed gaps, and concentrated defensive fire. It didn't matter. 2 B-24s went down in flames. A third lost 2 engines and crash-landed in Belgium 3 hours later. The jets escaped without damage. Some bomber crews succeeded in fighting back. On October 7, 1944, Major Richard Peterson, flying a P-51 Mustang, shot down an Me-262 during landing approach. The jet was vulnerable, with gear down, flaps extended, speed reduced for touchdown. Peterson had been orbiting German airfields for 2 hours, waiting for exactly this moment. He dove, fired a 3-second burst, and watched the jet cartwheel across the runway in flames. The pilot, Lieutenant Heinz Arnold, died on impact. Arnold had flown 6 combat missions, destroyed 4 bombers, survived every engagement. He died because he had to land eventually, and when he did, he became as slow as every other aircraft. It was the first confirmed kill of an Me-262 by a propeller fighter. 63 more would follow before the war ended. Most occurred during takeoff or landing. In the air, at altitude, with fuel and ammunition, the Me-262 remained nearly untouchable. On the ground, or transitioning between ground and sky, it was just another target. Post-war analysis revealed the dimensions of Germany's failure. If the Me-262 had entered service in January 1943, as Messerschmitt proposed, Germany would have possessed air superiority over its own territory for at least 18 months. Allied bombing campaigns would have stalled. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids of August 1943, which cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers in a single day, might have cost twice that number if jets had been operational. The October 1943 raids on ball bearing factories, which resulted in losses so severe that daylight bombing was temporarily suspended, would have been catastrophic with jets defending German airspace. 8th Air Force losses would have forced a strategic reassessment of daylight precision bombing doctrine. Some analysts estimated that delaying D-Day by 6 months was possible, maybe longer. Air superiority was a prerequisite for invasion. Without it, landing craft would have been vulnerable to air attack during the crossing. Beachheads would have been bombed continuously. Supply convoys would have faced interdiction that the Allies couldn't counter. The entire strategic calculus of the European theater depended on controlling the skies over the invasion corridor. If Germany had deployed 600 Me-262s by January 1943, that control would have been contested far more violently. But Hitler's insistence on the Schnellbomber, Göring's bureaucratic obstruction, and the Reich Air Ministry's refusal to accept innovation cost Germany the only technological advantage that might have altered the air war's outcome. The Me-262 was the fastest, most advanced fighter of World War II. Germany built 1,433 of them. Only 200 ever saw combat. Fuel shortages grounded most. Allied bombing destroyed the rest on runways and in factories before they ever fired a shot. The jet that should have dominated the skies became a symbol of wasted potential and strategic blindness, born from ideological arrogance and a refusal to adapt. Willy Messerschmitt survived the war. He was detained by Allied intelligence, interrogated, and released in 1947. He never designed another combat aircraft. When asked in 1965 why the Me-262 arrived too late, he gave an answer stripped of bitterness. Because the men who controlled its fate believed we were still winning. Lieutenant Robert Johnson returned to the United States in December 1944. He'd flown 116 combat missions, shot down 27 enemy aircraft, survived engine failures, flak wounds, and a mid-air collision. But the memory that stayed with him longest wasn't a dogfight or a bombing run. It was April 18, 1944, 30,000 feet above Munich, watching a jet disappear into cloud cover, faster than anything he could chase. In 1978, a journalist asked Johnson what he thought about the Me-262's delayed deployment. Johnson stared out a window for several seconds before answering. "If they'd had that thing in '43, I wouldn't be here. A lot of us wouldn't, but they didn't, and that's the only reason we made it home." The jet factories in Regensburg and Leipzig are gone now, dismantled after the war. The runways at Brandenburg-Brest are overgrown, cracked by decades of weather and neglect. A few Me-262s survive in museums, polished aluminum frames behind velvet ropes. Tourists photograph them, read placards describing speed and armament. But the plaques don't explain the 7 months lost to Hitler's Schnellbomber obsession. They don't mention Ernst Udet's memo, or Goering's refusal to retool factories, or the intelligence analysts who wrote that single line in April 1944. If they'd had this 2 years ago, we'd have lost the air war. War isn't decided by the weapons you build. It's decided by the decisions you make about those weapons. Germany built the most advanced fighter of the war, then sabotaged it with arrogance, paranoia, and a refusal to accept that speed wasn't a flaw. It was the future, and by the time they realized that, the future had already passed them by. The men who flew against the Me-262 knew how lucky they were, not because they were better pilots, not because they had better planes, but because their enemies spent 2 years arguing about whether innovation mattered, while American factories built 15,000 fighters and trained the crews to fly them. In war, the greatest victories are sometimes won by the other side's failures. The Me-262 was Germany's failure, and thousands of Allied airmen came home because of it. The jet remains a symbol, not of what Germany achieved, but of what they destroyed through their own incompetence. Speed kills, but indecision kills faster.